As we continue exploring the big book chapter by chapter, today we're going to talk about Bill's story. Now, to understand the writing and the editing of Bill's story, we need to first revisit some of the facts that preceded the first draft of that story. April of 1937, almost a year before Bill started writing, the New York group severs all relations with the Oxford group, and this is one of the most important and impactful events in Alcoholics Anonymous history, this stepping back from the Oxford group by the New Yorkers. This produces for them a crisis in terms of both vision and organization. If we're no longer riding along on the coattails of this international religious organization, then who are we and where are we going and how are we going to get there? So 6 months later, in October of 1937, Bill Wilson and Fitz Mayo and Bill Rudell and Sterling Parker, four of the members of the New York Alcoholics Anonymous contingent, go to Akron for what I call a summit meeting. And this is the famous counting noses meeting. When they got there, Bill always said there was he and Bob and Ann sitting around the kitchen table at Ardmore Street in Akron. And they made a list of the people that they knew had gotten sober using their method. And they counted noses, and they had 40 noses. This was a big deal. All of a sudden, they found a cure. We got a cure here. And Bill Wilson claims he got really, really, really excited and proposed 4 major things that they should be doing going forward so that they could spread this message of recovery and save lives across the country that much faster. He said, what we need is a string of hospitals all across the country. We're going to have alcoholic hospitals all over the place in all the major centers across the United States of America. And to bring people into those hospitals, we need, and to set up the meetings that would support those hospitals, we need a slew of paid missionaries. And we should be writing a book that puts down in black and white exactly what we're doing to stay sober. So to do that, they needed to raise just a ton of money. And not just for the book, but I mean, can you imagine how much money they needed for the alcoholic hospitals, probably a la Towns Hospital, where Bill got sober, all across the country, and a host of paid missionaries to bring patients into that hospital. But the majority of the Akron members, it was a very close vote, and I think Bill only won it because he had these New Yorkers there, was definitely not in favor of these grand plans. And nevertheless, Bill does call for a vote. And with Dr. Bob and these 3 New Yorkers there, they win by the barest of majorities. They pass. Okay, we're going to have hospitals, we're going to have paid missionaries, and we're going to have a book. But the Ohio members say, look, we're not giving you any money. So if you want money, go back to New York. That's where the money is, let's face it, and raise all that money for these grand plans you got, Bill Wilson. They go back and they put the touch on through 4 friends of his, John D. Rockefeller Jr. He's the richest man in the world, and he and his father they've been lavish contributors to the cause of temperance for decades. I mean, they supported the temperance movement right up until Prohibition, and then they supported the whole Prohibition thing right up until the 1930s, the very early 1930s, when Rockefeller turned against it because of the lawlessness that it had all created. So Prohibition had failed miserably. That was evident. But now this small group of people from New York and Akron, they're claiming they've actually discovered a cure. And they were using the word cure in those days, a cure for alcoholism. After this pitch they make to Rockefeller on March 17th, 1938, Rockefeller famously gives Dr. Bob only $5,000, which is spread out over several months. And he tells them, look, in any event, you will not look to me for a further contribution for this object. I always find that language a little stilted, but it's very, very clear what he's saying. I'm giving you $5,000 and that's it. Don't ever ask me for another penny ever again. We're done. April 24th, 1938, 5 weeks after this heartbreaking refusal from Rockefeller, Bill goes back to Akron and brings up the book proposal again. These guys are still not in favor of the book. They still think the book is a bad idea. They revisit all the negative arguments they'd made the previous October, trying to sway the vote against these proposals. And you know, some of these arguments they had were really interesting and very, very valid on some levels. I mean, one of the arguments was, look, if you put out a book, then we're going to have all hundreds, if not thousands, of people streaming into New York and Akron looking for us to help them. How are we going to help them? We don't have an organization to do that. There's nothing on the ground here that we could put together to actually help all of these people, and we'd all just be overwhelmed, and it would ruin the whole thing. It would ruin the whole thing. We need to grow much more slowly, much more organically. Bill doesn't call for a vote. He realizes he doesn't have any of those New Yorkers. He's got one New Yorker with him. Burt Taylor's with him. But he doesn't have enough votes to carry it. Bill was a consummate politician. and he realized that was not a good idea. So he proposes the idea in Akron. They are completely against the idea, and he just picks up his bags and goes back home to New York. But when he gets back to New York, Hank Parkhurst, his right-hand man in New York City, he just loves the idea. Hank Parkhurst loves the idea, and he becomes its biggest advocate. He claims that he tells Bill, he says, look, the profits from the book will finance the group going forward. We need to have money to keep this thing going. And it is going to generate some much needed cash for the founders. In May, Hank creates a rough business plan for the Alcoholic Fund, and he sends it to Bill just to make sure that we're thinking alike. And they are thinking alike. And the Rockefeller guys that are working with them, trying to help them raise money, those Rockefeller guys, they like the idea. So the plan gets accepted, and then on May 18th, 1938, Charlestown's Hospital donates $500 to the Alcoholic Fund as, quote, an advance on book. And Bill Wilson starts writing the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous on May 20th, 1938. Charlie sends him the $500, and Bill's got something to live on, so he can stop running around doing the things he's trying to do to scrounge up some cash on the financial markets in those days. Hank has convinced Bill that if they had just 2 chapters, all we need is 2 chapters, Bill, that they'd be able to use those 2 chapters as door openings to get appointments with some of those rich donors in New York City. We've been getting appointments. We've been trying to get appointments, but to get our foot in the door, what we need, if you write 2 chapters, I can send them out in this neatly tied up promotional package, and it'll get us the appointments we need to approach these people for money. The 2 chapters that he wanted written as promotional pieces were chapter number 1, There Is a Solution, and chapter 2, Bill's Story. Now, obviously, that's the reverse of the order they appear in our big book today. More about that later. But in the beginning, this was how it was going to work. They were going to open with the chapter, There Is a Solution, and they were going to follow it with a witness, a testimony, a real-life story about somebody who had actually taken that solution and worked it successfully. These 2 chapters are incredibly important and very unique in the history of the writing of the big book, because they're the only 2 chapters for which we have completely unedited first draft versions. The first drafts of all the other chapters in the big book have been lost. The earliest versions that we do have of the rest of the chapters they're all been polished up, and they the first time we have any record of them, they appeared in the Multilith Copy. All the earlier unedited things, or the edited things that were being done before the Multilith was printed, the Multilith was a pre-publication copy. So the book's going to come out in April, but in mid-February of 1939, they printed up a bunch of these Multilith copies, and they sent them around to people for corrections and suggestions. But so we don't know how severely chapter 3 through chapter 11, from More About Alcoholism to A Vision for You, were edited before they appeared in the Multilith Copy, which we do know about the first 2 chapters. So in relation to Bill's story, we have the very earliest version of that chapter. We can see many of the changes that were made both before and after the Multilith Copy was printed. Faced with the challenge of writing a chapter described for their solution, There Is a Solution, the way that would, in a way that would be acceptable to both New York and Akron. And we're going to learn a lot more about what a challenge this was and the difficulties when we discuss the writing of There Is a Solution in the next presentation. Bill almost certainly started with his own story first. So he starts writing on May 20th, and we can look at the evolution of the text of Bill's story starting in May of 1938, because we have 3 different versions preserved in the archives of his attempts to write his own story. And then the edits that were done just before the Multilith Copy was printed, there was a bunch of changes made then. And finally, we're going to look at the changes that were made just before the big book was printed. Between the Multilith Copy and the big book, there were more suggestions and changes made, some of them really significant to Bill's story. In short, there were a lot of changes made to Bill's story in the 11 months between the 3 drafts written in May of 1938 and the publication of the big book in April of 1938-9. Lots and lots and lots of changes. So he starts off with this is his first attempt to write. He called it The Strange Obsession. It amounted to 8 handwritten pages. It was just 14 paragraphs long, but Bill finally quits. He just quits in the middle of this thing. He doesn't even finish it. And this is what the first page of that looked like. There's Bill's handwriting. I really appreciate seeing this. I love seeing the scratch outs and the changes that he's making as he's going along with this thing. And it's just a fascinating document. And I'd like to note the numbers in the upper left-hand corner of the page here. So this is page number 1, and it says 125 over 875. And that's the count of how many words there were on that page and on the whole document. Bill Wilson's, in a letter to Dr. Bob that he writes in late June, he says he was shooting for 5,000 words per major chapter. So here he is, he's counting the words to see how many words he's going to have for this thing. And this is how the opening of that started. It was a dark and stormy night writing. This is Bill Wilson's, as far as I know, his first attempt at this kind of writing. It was a hot night in the midsummer of 1934. I found myself at a noted address in Central Park West, New York City. It was the Charlestown's Hospital for Drying Out Alcoholics. Sobering and sweltering with a fearful hangover, I laid abed in the upstairs room. Downstairs, the doctor looked across his desk at my wife, Lois. She was saying, "Doctor, why can't Bill stop drinking? He always had great willpower, yet here he is facing ruin again, and still he can't stop. The more he struggles, the worse he gets. I am scared, heartbroken, and confused. I know he is too. He'd do anything at all to stop. Tell me, doctor, why can't he?" Now, the doctor answers Lois' question by going into some detail. This is Dr. Silkworth, obviously, about his theories about alcoholism. But Bill just stopped and he abandoned that version mid-sentence almost. Most likely because he realized, and I'm speculating here, but most likely because he realized that he was telling the story from the doctor's perspective rather than telling his own autobiographical story from his perspective. So the next version, Bill types up the next version. And this is what this looks like. This is a copy of Stepping Stones at the moment. And it's a 36-page document, and it just runs out at the end of those 36 pages, and it's already 11,454 words long. So we're not even close to this 5,000 words that Bill's shooting for and trying to get. Now, aside from the length, there's a whole bunch of really interesting things in this document. It starts off by saying, it's a very strangely typed document for starters. And you see the numbers down the left-hand side. Every single line is numbered. And by the way, if you go to Google and type in with quotation marks, when I was about 10 years old, my father and mother, you'll get this. It's in a couple of different places on the internet. It's just a wonderful document. But those lines, each individual line being numbered, they're continuously numbered, page after page after page, up to 1180. A long document with lots of lines to it. This is the longest version of Bill's story, and it's often called the original story. Has a number of very interesting details about his life. They're just not found anywhere else. This is great autobiographical stuff. For instance, this is where we learn something about his grandfather's life, and we hear the boomerang story for the first time. I don't know if you don't know the boomerang story. His grandfather was constantly challenging Bill as a young man. And one time he told him only an Australian Aborigine could make a boomerang that worked. And Bill refused to do anything, school, housework, nothing, for supposedly days on end, weeks, until he had crafted a boomerang that worked. And he claims almost took off his grandfather's head when it came back around the church steeple. The boomerang story. It's a great story. It's a great Bill Wilson story. But those details were cut out of the story when he wrote his next version. I mean, he's 11,500 words. He's not even close to what he's looking for here. So finally, he gets some control of his material. And this is what an original typing of this chapter looked like. Again, it's chapter 2, not chapter 1, Bill's story. This is a copy out of the archive in New York City. And he's produced 11 typed pages, and he's got 5,347 words. So we're getting close to the target he's shooting for. This shorter version of Bill's story was a mixture of things. Some of the stuff he borrowed from the original story, but there's some completely new writing here. And a lot of this stuff in the beginning, as we're going to see, the facts about his early life get cut out completely later. Bill surely made some edits to his story before it was handed over to the professional critic Tom Usel for editing at the end of December 1938. Bill had the book finished in rough draft at the end of December 38. They gave it to this guy, Tom Usel, who was one of the two editors who was going to be working on the story. on the book, and Tom Usel made a bunch of changes. But we don't have any interim copies between that one copy I just showed you from the General Service Archive until we get to the Multilith copy, where we see all these changes, most of which were made by Tom Usel. By the way, that's different from There Is a Solution, because we not only have the original typing of There Is a Solution, but we've got 2 interim copies with changes. And we'll be talking about that when we get to when we explore There Is a Solution. Tom Usel made a number of very, very significant changes to Bill's stories before it was printed in the Multilith. Most importantly, he insisted on moving Bill's story up to the front of the book, making it chapter 1. Usel claimed that it was important to have a powerful story like this as the opening chapter. So originally we were going to have this expositional chapters in front, and then in the back we're going to have all the stories. And the first story was going to be Bill Wilson's story, followed by Dr. Bob's story. Those stories were originally put in there in almost chronological order. So Usel said, nope, we got to take Bill's story out of the back and put it up front, because that's what we need to inspire hope to any alcoholic picks up this book and starts reading it. He also cut out large chunks of the text, most especially the first 7 paragraphs of Bill's story, all those childhood and early years stories. They were all completely deleted. So now the new opening line of the chapter starts with World War I, 1918. Bill was born in 1895. So with war fever ran high. He also severely edited the opening lines of the second paragraph that was left in the book after he whacked out those first 7 paragraphs, which says, now, we landed in England. I visited Winchester Cathedral. Much moved, I wandered outside. This reduced Bill Wilson's white light experience that I have quotation marks around. He had a very deep spiritual experience at Winchester Cathedral, but now it's been reduced to just 2 words, much moved. Doesn't really tell you much, does it? And we're going to return to this important and confusing deletion later in the presentation. In all, by the time it was published in the Multilith copy in mid-February 1939, Bill's story had been reduced from the original 5,347 words to 4,338 words. It had been cut by getting close to 20% here. 1,000 words have been cut out of this story before it was printed in the Multilith. But there were still even more changes to come. Based on the suggestions and corrections that they received from the people who reviewed that Multilith copy that was printed in mid-February of 1939. Both minor and major changes were made to Bill's story in the final weeks before the big book went to press. I'll take a look at some of those. Here's one minor change that was taken. I love this one. Bill's mother's payment for his stay, or perhaps his stays at Towns Hospital, was recognized. The original line had read, my brother-in-law was a physician, and through his kindness, I was placed in a nationally known hospital. His brother-in-law, Leonard, was a doctor who paid for his stays there. But Bill had insisted that they include and my mother's. So now it was, and through his and my mother's kindness, I was placed in a nationally known hospital. We got a little recognition for mom coughing up some cash for her son to be rehabbed. Other small changes were suggested. Here's what a couple of those look like. So that line that closed the at the hospital paragraph was suggested go to the end of there I humbly offered myself to God paragraph, and that was taken. That was moved. It had more punch at that particular place. It was suggested that the word faith be put in here. I was to test my thinking by the faith within, the new faith within. And that was rejected. They didn't want to do that. They want to stick with the new God consciousness within. That was probably a Hank Parker's suggestion. And while living was accepted, I would have the elements of a way of life. And they changed it into living, a little bit more active vocal position. So that one was taken. But the later suggestion of change to God to faith, almost the same thing that was just rejected, this one coming from Dr. Howard, was in fact taken. So, and it was likely taken. The original thing had said God has to work 24 hours a day. And it was likely taken because of the handwritten comment there with the little arrow. It says, who are we to say what God has to do? So faith has to work 24 hours a day is the way that read when it was published. And by the way, the suggestion there comes from Dr. Howard. We're going to hear much more about Dr. Howard and some of the important suggestions he made to our book, many of which were taken. Later, we mentioned him when we were talking about the doctor's solution. He had a couple of suggestions there, and he's got a couple of minor suggestions here, this being one of them. Then there's this wonderful looping arrow on the right-hand side where it says he couldn't have talked to Ebby, etc. And then it says, oh, skip it though. Now, that comment, couldn't have talked to Ebby, skip it though, it's more than just a little bit cryptic. What are they talking about there? What are they talking about? Well, it clearly refers to some talk that Bill had with Ebby Thatcher. And the comment to skip it though might be a reference to the fact that this talk was already being covered in much more depth in the most important change made to the Multilith version of Bill's story. So the important change happened here on the original page 6 of Bill's story. And what we're looking at here is you see that insert with the caret and number sign and number 1. Insert number 1 on the left-hand side of the page there. That's where we're going to be making the big change. But before that, I just should note a couple of the untaken suggestions to replace the word God. So the suggestion was we're going to say, thus I was convinced that God is concerned with us humans. And they were suggesting a change to, thus I was convinced that there is a spiritual power that is concerned with us humans. Nope, don't want to do that. And at the end of that, it says, when we want him enough. And of course, that would have been changed to it had the spiritual power with small letters been put in there. And then also Dr. Howard had a suggestion that it had been a sincere desire to be bucked up. Nope, not going to put that in. Okay, back to the big insert. The major change to Bill's story indicated that 4 new and critically important paragraphs were to be inserted at this point in Bill's story, right there. The text of those 4 paragraphs can be found on 2 pages of the master copy of the Multilith printing. This is the copy that they kept in Newark, New Jersey, where Hank Parkhurst wrote in all the suggested changes. And in that master copy, we have these 4 paragraphs handwritten out that do get stuck into Bill's story when the big book is printed in April of 1939. And those 4 paragraphs are written in Hank Parkhurst's handwriting. And this is what that looks like. Up in the upper left, despite the living example of my friend, it's FR, it's just a little shorthand. They're bringing me the vestiges of my old prejudices. Okay, so, and you can see some of this is underlined, which is going to end up being italic in our book when it gets printed. So here's what the 4 paragraphs say. And there are people who think that these are the most, if not the most, they're very, very important paragraphs in the book, as certainly I do personally. Despite the living example of my friend, there remained in me the vestiges of my old prejudice. The word God still aroused a certain antipathy. When the thought was expressed that there might be a God personal to me, this feeling was intensified. I didn't like the idea. I could go for such conceptions as creative intelligence, universal mind, or spirit of nature, but I resisted the thought of a czar of the heavens, however loving his sway might be. I have since talked with scores of men who felt the same way. My friend suggested what then seemed a novel idea. He said, why don't you choose your own conception of God? That statement hit me hard. It melted the icy intellectual mountain in whose shadow I had lived and shivered many years. I stood in the sunlight at last. It was only a matter of being willing to believe in a power greater than myself. Nothing more was required for me to make a beginning. I saw that growth could start from that point upon a foundation of complete willingness. I might build what I saw in my friend. Would I have it? Of course I would. Now, this is Hank's handwritten insert for those 4 paragraphs to go into Bill's story, which were in fact inserted in Bill's story. And this is how it reads in our book today. Italics substituted for underlining. So that covers most of the historical stuff from the original documentations that can be found in the archives on how the 11,454 word first draft of Bill's story finally ended up being just 4,529 words when it was published in the big book, and as it appears in the big book today. Huge journey that story went on to get to that point. So let's do a quick recap of what it says in Bill's story. I mean, you can read the story. It's easy enough to follow this. He starts with his service in World War I, 1918. He studies law after he gets out of the service, and he's drinking, and he decides on a career in Wall Street. Doesn't want to do law. He travels to the East Coast with his wife, Lois. They're looking at companies and gathering financial information and trying to pick good investment opportunities, which he does with real skill and talent. He's successful at this speculation that he does when he gets back from this trip with Lois, but he's drinking a lot more, and he catches golf fever. He's playing golf in 1929, but then in October of 1929, the stock market crashes and the Great Depression begins. Bill bails out of New York. He offers a job up in Montreal, some guy that knows he's a real hotshot with the financial stuff, and but he ends up blowing that by drinking again. And once he comes back home from Montreal, his drinking gets even worse. He has no real employment for the next 5 years. And he makes all kinds of promises to Lois, all kinds of promises. He writes them in the family Bible, for instance. And we've got the hospitalizations. He gets in town's hospital 3 or 4 times by the end. He's got all kinds of relapses. His last drunk begins Armistice Day. That's November 11th, 1934. He's drinking. Ebby shows up. Ebby tells him he got religion. He's been cured, supposedly, by the Oxford group. Bill makes his last visit to town's hospital, December of 1934, and Ebby visits him in the hospital and continues the message of recovery for him. Faith without works was dead, his friend said. And for the next year and a half, Bill had no job, nada, nothing was going on. And he says, my wife and I, no job. My wife and I abandoned ourselves with enthusiasm to the idea of helping other alcoholics. When all other measures failed, work with another alcoholic would save the day. There's a foundational tenet of Alcoholics Anonymous right up there in Bill's story, and an early realization by them. A fellowship had grown up among us in one Western city and its environs. There were 80 of us and our families. Each day, my friend's simple talk in the kitchen multiplies itself. Kind of the note that Bill's story ends on. So for more than 80 years, that story has provided hope and inspiration for millions of alcoholics who have read it, people who have identified with Bill's drinking and his many failed attempts to stop, and then heard the message of recovery that he offers. And Tom Usel was surely right. That was the perfect way to start this book. Good job, Tom. So given all of that history and the dramatic import the story's had for so many decades, there's 4 things that I'd like to talk about in the various versions of Bill's story that I think are worthy of further investigation and certainly worthy of note. One of them is the confusion over Bill's white light experiences, that much moved stuff, and what else he says in his story about that. Second, I want to talk about the kitchen table story. Is that just another one of Bill Wilson's myths? Early on in this presentation series, I spent some time talking about how Bill Wilson wasn't a fan of messy details. He just pared things down to parables. He pared them down to the point he was trying to make. And I refer to them as either myths or parables. And I don't fault Bill Wilson for that, but from a historical point of view, it's a little confusing because a lot of times that wasn't really what happened. It was close to what happened, but not really what happened. Number 3, I want to talk about God as I understand him. Did that phrase was that already current in Alcoholics Anonymous in May of 1938? And I want to talk finally about the fact that 11 of the 12 steps can be found in those 2 versions of Bill's story. Something I found really interesting, if not shocking, when it first blossomed in my head that that's what was going on. So let's talk about the first one, Bill Wilson's white light experiences. Bill had 3, there was a couple of times in Bill's life that we're not talking about here, but there were these 3 primary times that he claimed to have had a deep spiritual experience. In Winchester Cathedral, which is in England, in the fall of 1918, just before he was to leave for France and the Western Front of the First World War. During Ebby's visit, when Ebby visited him after he started drinking on Armistice Day 1934, Ebby comes by and tells him, I got religion. That was in late November of 34. And then in Towns Hospital, where Bill ends up in December of 1934. So he has these 3 primary deep spiritual experiences. Now, each of these incidents are slightly different, as are the stories that Bill Wilson told about him at different times. And we have 4 early sources where Bill wrote about these 3 spiritual experiences. That long original story from late May of 38, Bill's story, the 5,400 word one, he finally got down to in late May of 1938. The Multilith printing, after the editors had gotten, the non-alcoholic editor had gotten his hands on it. And then the big book, as it was published in April of 1939, after the changes that were suggested and then taken from the changes from the Multilith printing to the big book. So let's look at these one at a time. So here's Winchester Cathedral #1. This is from the original story, the long story. And this is the best version we've got at that time of what Bill was talking about. I stood in Winchester Cathedral the day before crossing to France with head bowed. For something, it touched me then I had never felt before. I had been wondering in a rare moment of sober reflection what sense there could be to the killing and carnage of what I was soon to become an enthusiastic part. Where could the deity be? Could there be such a thing? Where now was the God of the preachers, the thought of which used to make me so uncomfortable when they talked about him? Here I stood on the edge of the abyss into which thousands were falling that very day. A feeling of despair settled on me. Where was he? Why did he not come? And suddenly, in that moment of darkness, he was there. I felt an all-enveloping, comforting, powerful presence. Tears stood in my eyes, and as I looked about, I saw in the faces of others nearby that they too had glimpsed the great reality. Much moved, there's that phrase, I walked out into the cathedral yard where I read the following inscription on a tombstone. Here lies a Hampshire grenadier who caught his death drinking small good beer. A good soldier is ne'er forgot, whether he dieth by musket or by pot. A squadron of bombers swept overhead in the bright sunlight, and I cried to myself, here's to adventure. And the feeling of being in the great presence disappeared, never to return for many years. That's Bill's best full-blown version of what happened to him at Winchester Cathedral. Now, when Bill's story, this is what he writes before the editor gets to it. While we were in England, I stood at Winchester Cathedral with head bowed in the presence of something I had never felt before. He's taken out a whole bunch of extraneous details. Where now was the God of the preachers? Across the channel, thousands were perishing that day. Why did he not come? Suddenly, in that moment of darkness, he was there. I felt an enveloping, comforting presence. Tears stood in my eyes. I had glimpsed the great reality. Much moved, I wandered through the cathedral yard. My attention was caught by the doggerel of an old tombstone. There's the doggerel again. And then he says, my mood changed because I was reading that doggerel. A squadron of fighters roared overhead. More distractions. I cried to myself, here's to adventure. And the feeling of being in the great presence disappeared. Now, when Ussel gets his hand on it, he does all kinds of changes to it. And now it says, as we said before, we landed in England. I visited Winchester Cathedral, much moved. So the whole thing has been reduced to 2 words. And then he says, ominous warning, which I failed to heed. I presume, now I'm speculating here, that Tom Ussel edited out the details of Bill's spiritual experience at Winchester Cathedral. I'm speculating because he feared that the mentioning God on the very first page of the book would be a mistake. I don't know that for a fact, but I can't come with any other good reason for him taking that out at the time. Whatever the reason, this has confused many AAs who only have that much moved reference to Bill's Winchester experience left in the story. Now, Bill was clearly a spiritually sensitive man, but his Winchester Cathedral feeling of being in the great presence was almost immediately destroyed by his conflicting war fever ran high enthusiasms. Still, that experience was so profound, that Winchester Cathedral was so profound that he remembered it clearly when he felt it again in November of 1934 during Ebby's visit. So this is our second experience. Here's Ebby's visit, first version from the original story. The man was transformed. Ebby was transformed. There was no denying he had been reborn. He was radiant with something which soothed my troubled spirit as though the fresh, clean wind of a mountaintop blowing through me. Now, people who have read the big book and Bill's story are familiar with that, but that's the kind of language he uses about his town's hospital experience. I saw and felt, and in the great surge of joy, I realized that the great presence which had made itself felt to me that wartime day in Winchester Cathedral had again returned. So Bill's re-experiencing what happened in Winchester Cathedral when he's sitting across the table with Ebby, who's telling him he's got religion. Now, when we get to Bill's story and the Multilith and the Big Book, these are all the same because the changes made to Bill's story were repeated and taken without any further changes. He said he talked for hours, meaning Evie, that wartime day in which old Winchester Cathedral came back again. Now, so this is in the Big Book, and it says that old Winchester Cathedral day came back to me again. But what do we know about that? Well, we know he was much moved. That's all we know in the Big Book. Thus, I was convinced that God is concerned with us humans when we want him enough. At long last, I saw, I felt, I believed. Scales of pride and prejudice fell from my eyes. A new world came into view. That's the result of this particular experience with Evie. The real significance of my experience at the cathedral burst upon me. For a brief moment, I had needed and wanted God. There had been a humble willingness to have him with me, and he came, but soon the sense of his presence had been blotted out by worldly clamors, mostly those within myself. I presume, again, I'm presuming, that this watering down, it's clearly a watering down of the earliest version of Bill's re-experiencing those feelings during Evie's version. From a great surge of joy, I realized that the great presence had made itself felt to me, had again returned to that way. It came back again. Boom. That was just the whole thing. Was because I presume that it was watered down because Bill drank again after Evie left. Whereas after he had that white light experience, the wind blowing through him like a clean wind up the mountaintop experience at Town Hospital, he didn't drink again. So I presume to avoid confusion over the impact and power of a deep spiritual experience, that it was toned down significantly. So then he's in Town's Hospital. Now, this is the first one. So the original story, again, that very long one, the original story tells both the Winchester Cathedral and the Evie visit story of Bill's spiritual experience, but it makes, I can't believe this, it makes no mention of having a white light experience in Town's Hospital. And a lot of that story is about his time in Town's Hospital. So that's a interesting omission on Bill Wilson's part when he was taking his first long stab at writing his story. In Bill's story, he says the price had to be paid. I really meant the obliteration of self. I had to quit playing God. I must turn in all things to the Father of light who presides over us all. These were revolutionary and drastic proposals, but the moment I fully accepted them, the effect was electric. There was a sense of victory followed by such a peace and serenity as I had never known. There was utter confidence. I felt lifted up as though the great clean wind of a mountaintop blew through and through. God comes to most men gradually, but his impact on me was sudden and profound. By the time it gets to the Multilith, there's just one little change made. He says the price had to be paid. It really meant destruction of self-centeredness, or formerly it said the obliteration of self. The rest of the text was left exactly the way it had appeared in that second version of Bill's story. Now, I love mentioning the fact we're going to step outside of those original contemporary 1930s documents to a thing that Bill recorded in 1954. And this is his, as far as I know, his most full-blown description of what happened to him in Town's Hospital, albeit, almost 20 years later. He said, I remember saying to myself, I'll do anything at all. If there be a grand physician, I'll call on him. Then with more faith, with neither faith nor hope, I cried out, if there be a God, let him show himself. The effect was instant, electric. Suddenly, my room blazed with an indescribable white light. I was seized with an ecstasy beyond description. I had no words for it. Every joy I had known was pale by comparison. The light, the ecstasy, I was conscious of nothing else for a time. Then, seen in the mind's eye, there was a mountain. I stood upon its summit where a great wind blew, a wind not of air but of spirit. In great, clean strength, it blew right through me. Then came the blazing thought, you are a free man. So like the original story being the longest and most fully fleshed out version of Winchester Cathedral, this is the most fully fleshed out version that I know of Bill's experience in Town's Hospital in December of 1934. And you can find that. Bill dictated this book with the help of a friend in September of '54 in Bedford Hills at the hotel there, and it was published by Hazelton in 2000. Bill W., My First 40 Years. Fabulous book. Fabulous book. Okay. The second thing I want to talk about is this kitchen table story. Is that another one of Bill Wilson's myths? Late November 1934, sober Ebby Thatcher visits the drinking Bill Wilson to bring him the message of recovery. Now, this is Bill's version, as you'll find it in the big book. Ebby calls. Bill answers the phone. Ebby comes over and they sit at the kitchen table. Ebby refuses a drink and tells him, I got religion. Bill hears the message, but he keeps drinking. End of story. Ebby's version. By the way, Ebby told this version. I've got 3 recordings of him telling this version. And one of them, Bill Wilson was in the audience, which I think is very, very interesting because it's a very different version. Ebby calls. Lois answers the phone. Not Bill. Lois answers the phone. And she invites him over for dinner a few days later. Not that same day. Doesn't show up that same afternoon. And when Ebby shows up, neither Bill nor Lois are home. They're both out. But then everybody finally gets together, and then Bill, Ebby, and Lois, and the woman who's renting the top floor of their brownstone from upstairs, they all have dinner together. And after dinner, the 4 move upstairs to the living room. Now, Lois at this point prompts Ebby. She says, well, let's hear about yourself. What's going on with you? Now, I'm presuming this is something of a setup. I presume she had talked to Ebby on the phone when he called and found out what was going on. So now she's very happy for him to come over and try and deliver some message about how to stop drinking to her husband. Ebby talks about the Oxford group until 1 a.m. He says he couldn't shut him up. He was just going, talking to these 3 people. At the end of that, Bill walks Ebby to the subway. Bill hears the message, but he keeps drinking. So the only real consistency here we have in these stories, correspondence of facts, is that number 1, Ebby calls, and at the very end, Bill hears the message, but he keeps drinking. All of which is true. Ebby told that messy version of his story on several different occasions, and he always acknowledged that the story you read in the book is a little different, and he once glibly explained those differences by noting that, after all, he happened to be sober that night, but Bill Wilson was drunk. And he pointed out that there were some of those details about that talk that Bill doesn't remember. But in the end, Ebby said, it doesn't make any difference because the idea is there, and the idea happened to get into Bill's head. Indeed, absolutely. It doesn't make much difference. The idea was there, and the idea did happen to get into Bill's head, and that's the important thing. In the first presentation, on the first 2 forwards, I spent some time showing that many of Bill Wilson's stories about early A history simply left out many of the messy details. Instead, Bill recast his experiences into parables, stories that would best deliver the message of sobriety to the newcomer. Bang. So no, I don't think knowing the messy details of that story does make any difference. I believe that Bill Wilson took that important experience and recast it into a parable with a message, a single, clear, concise message, a parable that would in no way be complicated or confused by the messy details that Ebby's reporting about what actually happened. The point of the myth Bill created about the kitchen table talk was to clearly and cleanly emphasize one of the foundational beliefs of Alcoholics Anonymous, and that is that the message of recovery can best be delivered by one alcoholic talking to another alcoholic. And the best way to repackage that story is to have the 2 men sitting across the kitchen table one-on-one, rather than 4 people in the conversation, including the woman from upstairs who's renting the top floor of the brownstone at 182 Clinton Street in Brooklyn. Bill's powerful version of that visit presented in his story has inspired millions of readers to identify and feel, perhaps for the very first time, some genuine hope for themselves and the possibility of their own recovery. It's a great story. Good job, Bill. I love that story. Okay. Number 3, I want to talk a little bit about God as I understand him. Was that really current in May of 1938? This is a frequently told story about that Jim Burwell, he was the New York atheist, was responsible for creating the phrase, God as we understand him. That story is based on things that Jimmy said and wrote about his own involvement with the writing of the Big Book and the 12 Steps. Jimmy gives a speech in March 1947 at Hope Manor. He says, then we took the God. This is his history of evolution of AA. Then we took the God. This is about the only thing I have given to this thing. I said, Bill, I'm an agnostic. We had quite a tussle. I had been staying sober, and so had Hank. After a time, we decided to put in there as you see it, which in my estimation is right because you're not putting pressure on them. It was the only way I could do it. Jim then he took that speech and he revised it into a piece which was printed up and distributed, most especially on the West Coast. Jimmy was living in San Diego at the time, and he called it The Evolution of Alcoholics Anonymous, A History of AA. And in that one, he said, after days of wrangling between Bill, Hank, and Fitz and myself, another thing changed in this last rewriting, and that was qualifying the word God in the last rewriting now with the phrase, as we understand them. This was one of my few contributions to the book. Then in 1955, they finally allowed Jim's story, The Vicious Cycle, to appear in the second edition of the big book. They wouldn't put his story in the first edition because he was an atheist and they knew he was going to drink. So they wouldn't let his story go in the first edition. So in his Vicious Cycle story, he says, around this time, our big AA book was being written, and I don't think the boys were completely convinced of my personality change, for they fought shy of including my story in the book. So my only contribution to their literary efforts, because they wouldn't put my story in the book, was my firm conviction, since I was still a theological rebel, that the word God should be qualified with the phrase, as we understand him. For that was the only way I could accept spirituality. Now, Bill Wilson getting ready to, he's collecting information so that he can start writing AA Comes of Age, which gets published in 57. And he writes a bunch of letters back and forth with Ruth Hawk. This is from October 7th, 1955. He says, Bill says, finally we had a big hassle in the Newark office between, as I remember, Hank, Fitz, you and me. Bill and Ruth. Fitz was for more God and more theology. Hank was for little or none at all. The result of this argument was the phrase God as we understand, which was of course a 10 strike. Whether or not Jimmy Burwell was present, I can't remember. In a historical piece, the one I just read you from, he wrote about this period. He claimed he had a great influence on the 12 steps. I certainly think he had some because of his agnosticism, but whether it was direct or not, I can't remember. So Bill's saying I can't remember him even being in the middle of these arguments in the Newark office. But note that the claim of Jim's stories about, nowhere does he say he invented that phrase. He only takes credit for being the one who insisted that it be inserted into the third step. And in the Multilith copy, it wasn't in the 11th step yet. It doesn't get inserted into the 11th step until the book is published. In fact, that phrase had been current in Alcoholics Anonymous for some time. So Jim didn't invent the phrase, but I do think that Jimmy was living with Hank Parkhurst at the time when they were having these arguments in Newark over the final phase and what should be going in the book and what shouldn't be going in the book. And I do think that Jimmy Burwell was cranking Hank Parkhurst up on these issues and sending him off to argue with Bill. So I'm okay giving Jim a bunch of indirect, and Bill said he didn't remember any direct credit. Well, I would give Jim a lot of indirect credit for getting God as we understand him into the steps. Thank you, Jim. So this is God as I understand him, number one. This is Bill's original story. Okay, we're back to that long story again. And he says, this is what my friend suggested I do. One, turn my face to God as I understand him. Whoa, May 1938, there it is right there. And say to him with earnestness, complete honesty of in, and that I henceforth place my life at his disposal and direction. Number two, in Bill's story, this is the shorter version, 5,000 some odd words. He says, I humbly offered myself to God as I then understood him, to do with me as he would. I placed myself unreservedly under his care and direction. I admitted for the first time that I myself was nothing, that without him I was lost. So we did not have to wait until the arguments of late 1938 and even early 1939 to get this phrase, this phrase, God as I understand him, was floating around. And people had been reading this story, this particular version of this story right there. It says so right there. So Jimmy, when he's making the argument, was just saying, Bill, you said it in your story. Why don't you just plug it into these steps here? Good job, Jim. So then, of course, there's the question of, did Eddie really use the phrase God as we understand him when he was talking to Bill in 1934? Because that's what Bill said in his stories, in those two versions I just read you. No one knows. And it's a subject that provokes heated arguments every time it comes up. Eddie was certainly preaching in 1934, December, fairly strict Oxford group teachings to Bill when he showed up at the hospital, when he showed up at the house in late November. And those most certainly included the four absolutes, and most likely a surrender to Jesus Christ. Because that's what those people were doing. That's exactly what those people were doing. I can't find anything in the Oxford group literature that says, well, you don't have to believe in Jesus. You can believe in any God as you understand him. It's okay. There wasn't that kind of flexibility. I don't see any evidence of that kind of flexibility. So I really doubt that Ebbe ever used that phrase to him. But who knows? Maybe when those Oxford people approached Ebbe, when they redeemed him out of Vermont and brought him down to New York and he got sober, maybe he was really resistant, and one of them said, listen, just make up your own idea, God will be okay. I don't know, maybe somebody did say something like that to Ebbe, and maybe David did say something like that to Bill. But it wasn't a common thing happening in the Oxford group in those days that they were saying, well, just believe in God as you understand him, it will be okay. Perhaps relevant to this argument between did it happen that way or was this something that we got added later, is Hank's March 1938 edition of those 4 new paragraphs to Bill's story, posing that why don't you choose your own conception of God question. And once again, we're left here with nothing but speculation. Really interesting questions. So I want to come to my last point in relation to what I find interesting, important, and worthy of note in Bill's story, and that was discovering 11 of the 12 steps in those 2 early versions of Bill's story. Late May 1938, Bill's stories, right? So one of the most dramatic moments I had at the GSO archive was when Michelle Mirza handed me, she's the GSO archivist, she handed me the original typed copy of Bill's story. Now, I'd known for years that most of the 12 steps could be found in Bill's story, but reading that copy that had been typed in May of 1938, I suddenly realized I had this just epiphany moment at the table in the GSO archive. I suddenly realized that the traditional story of Bill Wilson writing down the 12 steps for the first time in December of 1938, it just wasn't credible. Because I was looking at a piece of paper. I had in my hands a piece of paper written in May of 1938, and they were bits and pieces were right there. Digging deeper, I consulted a transcript of the longer original story and confirmed that even in this earliest full version of Bill's story, it explicitly mentioned several of the steps. In fact, the longer version clearly paraphrases 8 of the 12 steps, and the shorter version mentions 10, using slightly different language. So in those 2 versions of Bill's story written in May of 1938, we've got 8 in one and 10 in the other. That means that Bill Wilson had already written out 11 of the 12 steps, granted without numbers attached. I got that, a full 6 months earlier than the traditional story being told. And that, by the way, the step that's missing is the second step. And that missing second step material, as we have already seen, was added to Bill's story later in Hank Parker's handwriting. To confirm this, let's look at a side-by-side comparison of the 12 steps found in the Big Book, published in April of 1939, with these much earlier 1938 versions. I love this. This is just great. Left-hand side, we're going to get the Big Book and the 12 steps as we know them. On the right-hand side are the 2 stories. So this is probably the least tight comparison we've got here. Step number 1, like myself, he had admitted defeat. That would be epic. Step number 3, turn my face to God as I understand him and place my life at his disposal and direction. The original long story. The shorter Bill story, I humbly offered myself to God as I then understood him, to do with me as he would. I placed myself unreservedly under his care and direction. Covers just about everything in step 3. Step 4, take a thorough and ruthless inventory of my moral defects and derelictions. Or, I ruthlessly faced my sins of omission and commission, made a list of people towards whom I felt resentments. Step 4. 5, I should sit down with whatever person I chose and reveal to him without any reservation whatever the results of my self-appraisal, and to be really honest with myself and God. Now that covers 5. But he also said in Bill's story, I fully acquainted him with my problems and deficiencies, him being Ebbe Thatcher. 6, I was now willing to rid myself of all these defects. Moreover, I was willing to get rid of those defects. I was to understand that this would not be accomplished by myself alone. Therefore, step 7, I was to humbly ask God that he take these handicaps away, or became willing to have my newfound friend take them away, root and branch. Step 8, made a list of all the persons I had hurt or with whom I had bad relations. A little bit longer, in Bill's story, we made a list of people I had hurt or towards whom I felt resentments. I expressed my entire willingness to approach these individuals admitting my wrong. 9, approached these people, telling them I'd come to set matters right insofar as I possibly could, but discretion should be used lest others should be hurt. I was to write all such matters to the utmost of my ability. Step 10. This principle of making amends was to continue into the future. Continue to admit we were promptly wrong. When we were wrong, promptly admit it. Number 11, I was to test my thinking by the new God consciousness within. I was to sit quietly when in doubt, asking only for direction and strength to meet his problems as he would have me. And step 12. Now, on the left-hand side, I've emphasized the fact that in the very first printing of the big book, it didn't say having had a spiritual awakening. It said having had a spiritual experience. And in Bill's story, he says, the moment I fully accepted them, the effect was electric. I felt lifted up as though a great clean wind of a mountaintop blew through and through. 12a. 12b, I soon found that when all other measures failed, work with another alcoholic would save the day. And 12c, my friend emphasized the absolute necessity of my demonstrating these principles in all my affairs. In short, although Bill always claimed he first wrote down the 12 steps in early December of 1938, this is drop dead conclusive evidence that he had clearly written out 11 of them without numbers attached a full 6 months earlier in these two versions of his story. So when he was talking about his recovery, how he recovered, what he did to recover, he explicitly talked about 11 of the 12 steps in May of 1938. This fact that Bill had already clearly articulated the solution in his story was noticed very early. I found this really interesting. There was a second editor for our book, a woman named Janet Blair, who really nobody really knew about her until about 15 years ago when some correspondence was donated by one of her late relatives to the archive. And there were letters back and forth between Janet Blair and Hank Parkhurst, and one even to Bill Wilson. So Janet Blair, she's editing the text of the big book in early February of 1938. And she writes to Hank Parkhurst. She said, Mr. Parkhurst, may I say a word about the continuity? Now, it's already number one, okay? And there is a solution of number 2. It bothers me a little. Chapter 1 is Bill's story, right? Bill's story includes a description of the terrible dilemma in which he was when his friend came to him. It includes what the doctor thought. It includes a brief account of the fellowship. It tells the solution. Bill's story. In chapter 2, you never mention Bill or his friend, although the solution, as you call it in chapter 2, is already given in chapter 1. So here's a non-alcoholic woman reading this thing before it's even been published in the Multilith, and she's already noticed that Bill's story contains the solution. Those first 2 versions of Bill's story make no mention of the second step, but it's already noted between the February printing of the Multilith copy and the April publication of the book. Hank had added those 4 paragraphs to Bill's story, recounting how he came to believe. And there they are again, one more time. And that brings the total number of steps to be found in these different versions of Bill's story up to 12. Now, this is just a screenshot of my current copy of the big book. You can see the steps highlighted and circled. Number 1 is over on page 11. Number 2 is there on page 12, which are those paragraphs that Hank put in. And then on the right-hand side, we've got 3, 4, skip down to 5, back up to 6 and 7, 8, 9, 10 does not appear in the Bill story here that I can see. Then 11, 12a, 12b, and 12c are on page 14. 12 steps, right, in Bill's story. So whatever the changes and whatever the absolute truth of any particular event like the kitchen table story, Bill's story has delivered the message of hope and the possibility of victory over alcoholism to anyone who has ever opened the big book and read this dramatic first chapter. Thank you, Bill Wilson. Good job. And thank you.